Dark screen. A faint echo of church bells tolling. Then the shuffle of heavy boots across stone floors. A winter wind seeps through narrow Tudor windows. The camera lingers on a flickering torch, its flame bending as though recoiling from the stench in the air. The year is 1540. A king awaits his bride. Not just any king, but Henry VIII, a monarch whose appetites have consumed kingdoms, churches, and wives alike. His throne is stained with desire and blood. And now the chamber doors creak open. Anne of Cleves steps inside. Draped in silks meant to dazzle, but under the weight of watching eyes, she appears fragile, out of place. A lamb led into a court of wolves. Henry's gaze locks onto her. The room falls silent. No music, no joy. Only the echo of his breath, heavy, strained. His face twists, not in passion, not in admiration, but in disgust. What should have been the triumph of alliance becomes a theater of humiliation. The king recoils, whispering words that would echo for centuries. I like her not. But here lies the hidden irony. While he mocked her body as rotting, it was Henry himself whose flesh was decaying. His once mighty frame was now swollen with disease, his legs ulcerated, his body betraying him with every step. A king rotting in spirit and in flesh, projecting his own downfall onto a woman he barely knew. This is not just the tale of a failed marriage. It is the story of survival, of a woman cast aside in shame, yet destined to outlive the tyrant who could not bear to touch her. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I love seeing our cursed chronicles reach every corner of the world. And if you love haunting tales from the shadows of history, make sure to subscribe now. You won't want to miss the dark secrets still to come. Europe in the 16th century was a chessboard of power, each piece maneuvered not for love but for survival. The Reformation had torn Christendom in two, and Henry VIII, having severed England from Rome, found himself isolated. Enemies lurked on every border, Catholic powers sharpening their blades, waiting for the chance to crush his fragile sovereignty. What Henry needed was not affection, nor beauty, nor companionship. He needed an alliance. And that alliance was to come from the German states of the Holy Roman Empire. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most trusted minister, saw the answer in Cleves, a modest duchy whose ruler leaned Protestant. To bind England with Cleves would be to plant a shield against both France and Spain. But politics in Tudor courts was never sealed with ink alone. It demanded flesh, a bride whose body became a treaty. That bride was Anne of Cleves. Her face, unfamiliar in London, was delivered not by her presence but by the brush of an artist. Hans Holbein the younger, master painter of the Tudor court, was dispatched across the sea. His task was not merely artistic, but diplomatic. To capture and in oils, to deliver her likeness as a promise of beauty, fertility, and dignity. The portrait that returned was luminous. Anne's features were refined, serene, unthreatening. Her garments rich, her posture noble. In her painted eyes, Henry saw not the woman, but the salvation of his throne. He gazed at the portrait as one might study a relic, believing in its truth, choosing to ignore the whispers that even the finest paintbrush could flatter. Yet beneath the painted layers lay a dangerous illusion. Holbein had captured not deceit but diplomacy. He had painted her as she ought to be seen, not as she truly was. And in that gap between brushstroke and breath, destiny was already sharpening its knife. Henry, charmed by the image, agreed to the match. Cromwell celebrated his triumph, convinced he had secured not only England's safety but his own grip on power. But already, storm clouds gathered. For even as the contract was signed, unease spread through Henry's court. The king who once measured women by their laughter, their fragrance, their softness, was about to marry a woman he had never touched, never spoken to, never even seen. And so the deal was sealed, not in passion, but in desperation. A king clinging to allies, a minister gambling his career, and a bride who had no choice but to obey. The stage was set for a union that would unravel before it ever began. If stories like this intrigue you, the bargains sealed in portraits, the lives traded for politics. Give this video a like. It helps Cursed Chronicles uncover more shadows of history for you. The journey from Cleves to England was long, marked by frost and uncertain skies, but at its end was to meet her destiny. The English court had prepared with anxious pomp, and Henry himself, restless and eager, devised a plan. He would greet her not as a sovereign but as a lover in disguise, cloaked in the romance of old tales where kings and knights tested their brides to be. He imagined a moment of instant recognition, of passion ignited at first sight. But when Henry entered the chamber at Rochester, and did not fall to her knees in awe, she did not shower him with embraces or words of devotion. To her, he was no king in shining armor, no prince from the portrait. He was only a stranger, red-faced and broad, with thinning hair and the heavy breath of illness. She greeted him politely, with the composure of a woman trained to observe courtly manners, but she showed no spark of desire. Henry, accustomed to being worshipped, was humiliated. The illusion painted by Holbein shattered in an instant. Here stood not the serene figure of the portrait, but a woman whose German fashion seemed plain, whose manner felt awkward, whose every gesture reminded him that reality had no obligation to flatter his expectations. In that silence, in that simple greeting, Henry felt mocked by fate itself. Later, in private, he raged. To his courtiers he confessed his disgust, calling and the Flanders mare, comparing her to a horse rather than a queen. The insult would stain her legacy for centuries, though it said more about the king's bitterness than the woman herself. For Henry, who had expected a vision of grace and youth, the shock was unbearable. He felt trapped, bound to a bride who stirred no desire, yet chained by treaties and politics he dared not break. The portrait had promised salvation. The flesh delivered disappointment. The man who had once shattered a church for love now recoiled from the woman chosen to save his crown. It was not only and who entered England that winter. It was the ghost of Henry's own disillusionment, a specter that would haunt their marriage from its first breath. If you're enjoying this cursed tale of Tudor deception, give this video a like. It helps more history lovers discover our channel. The wedding day dawned on the 6th of January, 1540. Westminster was dressed in gold and crimson. Yet beneath the glitter of banners and tapestries lay an unease that no ceremony could conceal, and stood adorned in heavy silks and jewels, a bride prepared for the role of queen. Around her, courtiers whispered prayers for stability, for the strength of this union to hold together a fragile realm. Henry entered the chapel not as a jubilant groom, but as a man burdened. His face was drawn, his expression cold, his movements heavy with reluctance. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged, but those closest to the king would later recall the absence of joy. There was no radiance, no tenderness in his glance. It was the wedding of two strangers bound by treaty rather than desire. That night, in the chamber prepared for consummation, silence hung thicker than the tapestries on the walls. Henry approached his bride, but passion refused him. He would later claim that Anne's body repelled him, that she smelled unpleasant, that her charms were nothing but artifice. But those words disguised another truth, that Henry's own body was failing him. His swollen frame, his ulcerated legs, his flagging vigor all betrayed him in the moment he needed to prove himself most. Yet instead of admitting weakness, he laid the blame on her. Physicians were called, as though the mysteries of the marriage bed might be explained by scholars in robes. Whispers spread that Anne's very person was the problem, that she was unfit for Henry's touch. Each day the story twisted further, painting her as the flaw in a union already doomed. Courtiers laughed behind closed doors, gossip winding like poison through the halls. And Anne, bewildered and isolated in a foreign land, bore the shame in silence. Yet those who saw Henry closely knew the rot was his. His wounds festered. His breath carried the scent of sickness. His temper grew violent. The king who once charmed and conquered now masked his decay behind accusations. In the theater of Tudor politics, it was safer to humiliate a queen than expose the weakness of a king. What should have been the dawn of alliance was already the dusk of humiliation. The marriage was not a bond but a wound, festering from the start. And in the darkness of those early months, Anne began to understand. She was not a bride cherished, but a pawn discarded, caught in the shadow of a monarch who could not face the ruin within himself. If this haunting glimpse into Tudor marriage intrigues you, make sure you're subscribed to Cursed Chronicles, so you never miss the darkest corners of history we bring to light. The truth Henry tried so desperately to bury could not be hidden forever. His rejection of Anne was not born only of disdain, but of a body slowly collapsing under its own weight. The king who once strode with vigor now hobbled on legs ulcerated to the bone. His bandages soaked daily with pus and blood, the stench clinging to his chambers like a curse. Courtiers whispered that one could smell his presence before he entered the room. Once, Henry had been the golden prince of Europe, tall, broad-shouldered, a hunter, a dancer, a king who embodied strength itself. Now he was swollen and grotesque, his face puffed and ruddy, his belly vast, his skin inflamed. Each movement sent pain searing through him. His temper, once fiery but controlled, now flared into unpredictable rages, as though the rot in his flesh had seeped into his soul. Some modern scholars believe he suffered from chronic leg ulcers and deep infections, perhaps compounded by obesity and untreated diabetes. Whatever the cause, the effect was unmistakable. Henry, the Lion of England, was rotting alive. And yet, in his court no one dared to name the truth. To admit that the king himself was decayed was treason. It was far easier to turn the accusations outward, to paint and as the flawed, the unworthy, the one who had failed. Thus the cruel irony. The woman branded the rotting queen was in fact the healthier of the two. It was Henry's body that betrayed him, Henry's spirit that decayed. But he projected his loathing onto her, as though by humiliating and he could disguise his own corruption. She became his scapegoat, a mirror he shattered so he would not have to look at his reflection. In this theater of shadows, truth was smothered beneath rumor, and Anne's reputation withered. Yet the real rot was not in the queen, but in the king who recoiled from her touch, fearing perhaps that she reminded him of his own mortality. Do you think Anne was truly rejected for who she was, or was she a victim of Henry's failing body and pride? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. Thomas Cromwell had wagered everything on Anne of Cleves. For years he had been the architect of Henry's Reformation, the hand that tore down monasteries, the mind that rewrote the kingdom's laws to serve the king's will. But power in Tudor England was as fragile as glass, and with Anne Cromwell placed his final bet. The marriage was meant to cement England's place among the Protestant powers of Europe, shielding it from Rome, Spain, and France. Yet what Cromwell envisioned as triumph became the very noose that tightened around his neck. When Henry recoiled from his bride, his disgust did not end with Anne. It turned upon the man who had brought her to him. The whispers at court sharpened into knives. Enemies Cromwell had crushed began to circle, eager to see him fall. By the summer of 1540, the annulment was inevitable. The king declared the marriage void, claiming it had never been consummated. And, obedient and careful, accepted her fate with grace. But Cromwell was not afforded such mercy. He was dragged before Parliament, accused of treason and heresy, the marriage to and painted as his ultimate betrayal of the king's trust. On a July morning, as the bells tolled over London, Cromwell's life ended on the scaffold. His rise had been meteoric, his fall was absolute. And in that bloody moment, the lesson of the Tudor court was clear. One failed calculation, one marriage gone wrong, could erase a lifetime of service. For Anne, Cromwell's execution was a chilling reminder of her own peril. She had lost her crown, and now the man who had gambled her future was gone. Yet unlike him, she had chosen silence, obedience, and survival. It was this very humility that spared her the axe that so many others had felt. If you want to uncover more stories of power lost and lives destroyed in the shadows of history, make sure you're subscribed to Cursed Chronicles, because here, every rise and fall is remembered. Anne's story did not end in disgrace, but in transformation. When the annulment was declared, she bowed her head, not in defeat, but in wisdom. Rather than protest her innocence or fight for a crown that had already slipped from her grasp, she accepted her fate with a calm dignity that stunned even her enemies. In doing so, she achieved what no other of Henry's wives could. She lived. Henry, perhaps guilty, perhaps eager to rid himself of blame, granted her a generous settlement. Palaces, estates, and a lifetime income were placed at her disposal. She was no longer Queen of England, but she was given a new title, one unique in Tudor history, the king's beloved sister. With it came a peculiar freedom. She no longer shared Henry's bed, but she gained something rarer, his protection, and embraced this role with quiet strength. She visited court when required, smiled graciously at ceremonies, and maintained cordial ties with Henry's children. The princesses Mary and Elizabeth found in her not a rival but a friend, a gentle presence in a household often torn by suspicion and betrayal. She became a figure of stability in a court drenched in intrigue, her simple acceptance disarming those who had once mocked her. While Catherine Howard, Henry's next bride, danced toward doom, and remained at peace in her new estates. She hunted, played cards, received guests, and enjoyed the independence denied to so many women of her rank. She had no husband to command her, no crown to endanger her. She had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but untouchable. Her survival was not born of power or influence, but of something far subtler, resilience. She learned that in Henry's world, silence could be stronger than defiance, and yielding could be a form of triumph. Where others fought the king and lost their heads, and yielded and kept her life. If Anne's quiet strength inspires you, subscribe to Cursed Chronicles, because here we uncover the forgotten survivors who outlasted tyrants and rewrote their own fate. History often remembers Anne of Cleves through the insult Henry hurled at her, the wife he could not bear, the queen he would not touch. But her true legacy lies not in humiliation, but in endurance. She outlived Henry, outlived Catherine Howard, outlived Catherine Parr. While others lost their crowns to the axe, and kept her peace, her wealth, and her dignity. When Henry died in 1547, and walked in his funeral procession, not as a widow in black, but as a woman who had survived him. In the years that followed, she withdrew from the chaos of politics, residing quietly in her estates at Richmond and Chelsea. She cultivated gardens, hosted her stepchildren, and lived as a noble lady free from the king's demands. She was the only one of Henry's wives buried in Westminster Abbey, a resting place reserved for monarchs and saints. Her tomb still stands as a silent defiance of the shame once cast upon her. The irony is haunting. The king who projected rot onto his bride decayed in both body and soul, remembered for cruelty, gluttony, and the trail of broken women he left behind. The queen he scorned as unworthy endured with quiet grace, leaving behind not scandal but survival. In the end, Henry's rejection became Anne's salvation. She was the untouchable queen, not because she was despised, but because she slipped beyond the reach of his violence. The one wife who did not share his bed was the one wife who outlasted his fury. If stories like this move you, the tales of those who endured humiliation yet triumphed through survival, then subscribe to Cursed Chronicles. Here we keep alive the voices history tried to silence.